Yeah, so welcome everybody. My name is Jen I run Prairie Springs Environmental Education Center. Jen Youngblood and I have worked together on a few occasions. She's helped me out with some of my summer camp kids, and we've had some Alaska conversations and other things. So I was very excited to ask her if she would be interested in presenting something, and on Earth Day, no less. So happy Earth Day, everyone. So I'm glad we get to do something that gets us thinking about the earth and our connection to it. So with that, Jen, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself and where you're at now in your career and get us going tonight.
Well, Jenna, thank you. And I want to say thank you, everybody, for your attendance tonight. I am really humbled to be here, especially on Earth Day. We've been talking about it all day. Bio blitzes are flying around the forest. So tonight I just want to, I'll introduce myself, but I wanted to kind of just start by saying, tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of tribal nations and the relationships to national forests, primarily in the eastern states. And first I want to come with my disclaimer. I'm here tonight as a Carroll alum. I'm here as a Muskogee Creek person sharing information that's passionate to me. I am not here as a Forest Service employee. So know that because I'm not in uniform, so I'm not official. So I want to say Estango. And what I'm saying to you tonight is, how are you? And so now I'm going to introduce myself in Muskogee Creek language. And I want to say, please understand, I'm not a fluent speaker of this, and I'll explain a little later in this presentation why, but it's due to some family history. And as we get into some of the historical context of this, I'll share that with you. But I want to say tonight, Hesche, Jen Youngblood, Johojef Gados, Fuzugoi, we gotcha, Mado. And so what I've said to you tonight is, hello, my name is Jen Youngblood. My clan is Panther, and thank you so much. And so in my secondary life, I'm actually calling from Wakefield, Michigan. I almost said Wisconsin. Just bought a house up here in the UP. I'm the Deputy Forest Supervisor on the Chippewa National Forest in Cass Lake, Minnesota. And for many years, I've been working with tribal nations all over the world. And I've done a lot of environmental science and natural resource management, as well as cultural resource management with multiple tribes and indigenous communities in Central and South America, in Far East Russia, and all over. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the history, culture, and lessons that we've learned in the East as it relates to American Indians and national forests. And so again, let me see, why isn't it? I'll go over there. There we go. Okay, so I'll get this, Zachary, bear with me. So tonight, I want to do some overview of this, and these are some of the buckets I want to talk about tonight. But the common thread I want to kind of share with you through this presentation tonight is land and sovereignty. So think of it as we're going to build a house together. We're going to talk about the foundation, which is the legal constructs of Indian law. We're going to look at the walls of history. We're going to put the furniture in the house before we put the roof on, and that's relationships. And then the roof is going to be tribal self-determination and forestry management. Let me get this to go. So to begin with, there is a foundation and the bedrock of federal Indian law, and it's a really important framework that we need to understand, is the Marshall Trilogy. And these three cases that you see here from 1823 to 1832 really rose from the states were really trying to exert powers over tribes, and the federal government felt that that was not the appropriate place to go. And so what happened was Chief Justice Marshall crafted these opinions, and he did this through consensus, building conversations with other justices. And it basically gave rise to the concept that Indian nations retained their inherent nation status. And really those relationships, those nation-to-nation relationships, were solely within federal power. And so these cases are the ones that really have set the standard. And as we move forward, you'll see kind of how all these tie together. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is canons of construction in federal Indian law. Now, this isn't a law course, so I do not want to get you, I have a law degree, and I do not want to get you so deep in here you're going, your eyes are rolling back and you're going, what is she talking about? But I do want you to be aware of where the foundation of the special relationship between the federal government and tribes flows. And the canons of construction basically grew out of, where we were getting rules for the recognition of treaties with tribes. And we're going to talk a little bit about these different eras from the treaty era to the self-determination area. So you'll be able to kind of get a picture. So, but what we're doing right now is we're just painting a little bit on our canvas. And so the canons of construction are used by the Supreme Court to really set forth what is not taken away, the rights, the inherent rights, and in the rights and treaties that are not taken away from tribes. But what's happened in the past is using these canons of construction, there's been some inconsistencies in the Supreme Court rulings. And over the years, there's been periods where they've been pretty consistent. There's been periods where they've been inconsistent. And what's happened is this has created jeopardy of tribal rights. It's challenged tribal interest, and it's really sometimes challenged the federal Indian trust responsibility. And so what these are, there's three canons that I want you to be aware of as we walk through this, is the treaty canon. And what that is really when the court's looking at something, they have to look at the viewpoint of, did the tribes, what was their original understanding when that treaty was signed? What did they mean? It might mean something different in the English language than it would mean in a traditional cultural language. Then there's the ambiguity canon. And that canon really is for the courts to say, if there's any ambiguities or uncertainties, then they must err on the side of tribes. And then the last canon is the congressional intent canon. And so it's basically the court asks itself the question, did Congress intend for these rights to be extinguished or abrogated? So the next thing I want to do is set up, there's a term called Indian country, and you may or may not have heard about this, but this is a legal definition, and it is very appropriate to use when you're working with tribes. And this term, having worked for a tribe, we among environmental professionals and tribes use it all the time because it is a standard legal definition, and it's just kind of easier to say. This term was really first delineated in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And that was as the country was being settled, as Europeans were coming over. They made some treaties with the tribes or agreements with the tribes, basically to say, well, we're not going to step on your land. We're just going to stand down a little bit. And so it was codified. This term was codified in 1948 and 49 in the US Code. And so I won't go through all this, but it really clearly delineates what is considered Indian country. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go through some historical eras to set this up. We have 5 of these eras, and the first era is treaty making, and that was 1778 to 1832. And really, as America was being colonized, the European nations that were colonizing the United States began making treaties with tribes. And before America became independent, the British entered into several tribes throughout New England because these were really to exclude other countries from doing commerce or business with the colonies and with the tribes. And so what happened was, as these treaties were signed, Congress decided in 1790 to pass the first Trade and Intercourse Acts. And that really was kind of the first start of this. And so I want you to know that the United States signed its very first treaty with the Delaware tribe in 1778. Delaware tribe is also known as the Lenape people. The Lenape original homelands are in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. And here's a little side note. And Sue, you said you're in New York. There was a repatriation of Lenape ancestors at the Statue of Liberty National Monument a few years ago, because that is their homeland. And they worked with Park Service to be able to return those ancestors to the ancestral homelands. So when we talk about treaties, a lot of people, well, they're treaties, they're old, they don't count. Well, first off, treaties are the highest law of the land. And what allows the US to enter into treaties is Article 1, Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution. And basically, Article 2 allows the president to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And since signing the treaty with the Lenape, the United States has entered into about 350 to 400 treaties with tribal nations. But no, I'm gonna get a drink of water, sorry. In 1871, Congress ended formal treaty making with Indian tribes, and basically that took away about 100-year-old diplomatic tradition where tribes were recognized as nations. But as we move through this, you'll see things have gone, the pendulum has swung back and forth. So the next era that I want to talk about is removal and assimilation, and that was from 1887 to 1934. And my family lived through this. Some of my family, my great-grandmother was one who lived through this, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So the primary intent of this era was to control and alter customs and practices. It was really to restrict those practices and to really, alter that. And so BIA agents really played large roles in the resocialization of Native peoples. And sometimes if folks didn't get along, they would ration the food rations, they wouldn't give them to them if they didn't want to abandon the traditional lifeways. And there is record that some government agents also kidnapped children and placed them in boarding schools, whether they be military or religious, to basically instill the American ideals and English and have them stop speaking their language. And my great-grandmother was one of those children. That's why I'm not a fluent Native speaker. So during this era, the United States began to really break those treaties. And so in 1877, the Dawes Act was passed, basically providing little pieces of land to Native American families, didn't provide the best land to them. And so a lot of the tribes lost their really valuable, rich land resources. And it was kind of a conundrum for tribal citizens because there was issues with completeness and accuracy of the rolls, the Dawes rolls. There was often, if you were in good standing, like if you were compliant and you were in good standing with a BIA superintendent, you were fine. But if you weren't in good standing with them, they could deny you those allotments. So I want to move to the next section. It's reorganization from 1924 to 1934. This was really a final push to really disconnect Native people from their culture and their lands. And really, it was kind of 1934, we began to see the New Deal legislation. So this brought about the Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps, and actually there was a second branch of the Civilian Conservation Corps which allowed Native Americans to work on public projects on their own reservations. And really for the forest, this began the use of youth conservation corps that we use during the summers to do a lot of work. We have a lot of tribal youth conservation corps. And so really this New Deal, I want to back up a minute. In 1934, we had the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, and that abolished the Dawes Act, and it made funds available to groups, Native American groups, to purchase back some of the lands that they lost during all of these other periods. And so it also established preferential hiring, and it really wasn't a wholesale success, but it did start shifting the pendulum towards tribal self-determination. But then we enter into termination, which really is the darkest period in tribal history. And that was from 1953 to 68. And this really, the kind of the subtlety of the Termination Act was people thinking, well, we're gonna really terminate the tribes so they can definitely be self-sufficient. But the converse was, it wasn't intended to liberate tribes, but it was really to control and erase that culture and push tribes back into mainstream society. And so the focus of this period was terminating the U.S. government's treaty-based trust responsibilities to Indian communities, and really having those individuals not be part of the collective, but assume really the responsibilities of, you're just a citizen, you're just the same as everyone else. And congressional intent, it has been historically looked at that this was the abrogation of all treaty provisions, rights, and responsibilities. So, and really the extinguishment to rights to land, hunting and fishing, and healthcare, educational programs, and everything else that tribes hold of value within their communities. And so a little bit during this time is tribes were really, there was 109 Indian tribes and bands that were terminated during this time. And a couple that are in this region were the Menominee and the Potawatomi. And there were tribes in California, there were tribes in New York, Florida, Texas that were terminated. And with this termination of these tribes, it pulled, because land is held into trust by the federal government. And so what it did was it basically removed 1.3 million acres from that trust protection and basically put it back out on the market so non-natives could buy this land. And basically this impact, and it sounds small, but if you think about that time frame, 1953 to 68, the population in Indian country was much less than it is now. And so this termination affected 11,000 Indian people, and it was about 3% of the population. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you lose your language, you lose culture. When you lose culture, you lose identity. So it was kind of a domino effect. But let me talk a little bit about the self-determination era. So that is 1968 to present. And I did this little diagram because I talk about this a lot, and I think it's easier than just talking about it. But the self-determination era is still going on today. And we now see it with the administration that's in now. They have made it very clear that tribal issues are a priority. Tribal engagement is a priority. We now have Deb Haaland, who is a friend of mine, who is now the Secretary of Interior, the first Native and a woman as Secretary of Interior, which she's doing a lot of things that I think are going to make changes within Indian country. But the self-determination era really started with the explosion of civil rights and activism in the 60s. And it really ushered in a new wave of tribal leadership. We saw changes in the political attention and the legal and civil tactics that that tribes were saying, hey, we're not the silent people. We have culture. It's just not what you think it is. And we saw movements such as the ROC, the Red Power movement, the American Indian movement, and really those really became much more active. And we saw the National Congress of American Indians, which was actually created in 1944, become much more politically and active and policy driven. And so we had leaders such as in the 60s, such as Richard Oakes, who was Mohawk, who really led the ROC, the 18-month-long Alcatraz stand on the ROC, demanding recognition and fulfillment of promises made by the Johnson administration's war on poverty to tribal nations. We had professors Jack Forbes and Dave Riesling, who created the first doctoral program in Native American Studies at UC Davis. And we had folks like Dennis Banks, who was Ojibwe, that founded the American Indian movement. And he really fought to protect Indigenous peoples living in projects in Minneapolis. Next slide. So all of that leads to the creation of the National Forest. And so the Weeks Act is actually what created the Eastern National Forest, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where it traces its intellectual roots, because it was signed into law in 1911. So we have a lot of history prior to that. So there was a book published called Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action. And this was published in 1864 by George Perkins Marsh. This book was really a combination of history, science, his personal observations in the United States and traveling around. And this book really provided this new intellectual foundation for the forest preservation movement. And he inspired folks to look at what remained of American public lands and to protect eastern forests, because we saw, during this time, we were starting to see some destruction. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute. And so, he started kind of this snowball. And so in 1876, Congress wanted to study American forest conditions. And they decided to create the U.S. Division of Forestry in 1881. And a gentleman named Franklin Howe was the first chief of that division. And he really did a lot of work compiling information on forest resources, the lumber industry, relevant land laws. And those reports really recommended the withdrawal of public lands containing forest from sale or grant. And basically from this, they started thinking, we have to have a better management plan. And they came up with the Forest Reserve Act in 1891. And then in 1905, the USDA Forest Service was created, with Gifford Pinchot being the first chief of the Forest Service. And so during all of this time, there was this determination made that destruction of young timber needed to supply future generations was really, and they said in quotes, the highest degree of folly. And there was this fear running through Americans at that time that given the rate of the timber was being cut, that we were going to run out of wood within a few decades. And the Census Bureau started putting out statistics. They had a timber famine timeline that they were talking about between 1850 and 1900, because lumber production had went from 5.4 billion board feet all the way to 44.5 billion board feet. That's a lot. I mean, that's exponential. And these pictures will kind of, explain that when I go to the next slide. But now, as lands were managed, that's not the case. They're managed sustainably. Regeneration is looked at with trees, of tree stands and age classes of trees. So the Weeks Act really created the presidential power to set aside public lands as forest reserves to protect watersheds. That's really what the underlying concept was. And so in 1907, forest preserves were renamed national forests. And so in the East, we had a really unique situation. You think about the Forest Service and the forests out West, but the East is a little different. We had little federal public land, and the watersheds were really unprotected. And by the 1880s, loggers, or you've heard the term timber barons, had really taken most of the valuable timber. And especially when you look at the landscapes of Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and northern Michigan, they had removed most of it, and from here and from the New England states, and they were already out buying forests on the West Coast and in the South. And so we also had farmers who had sold off the timber, and they'd exhausted their lands, and they left their lands. They just walked away from their lands, and these lands were left prone to fire and erosion. And so these abandoned, really bad, awful looking cut over forests became known as the lands nobody wanted. And this came from a book written by William Shand and Robert Healy. And I just wanted to bring that title up because that has created many fierce conversations between, federal employees and tribes, because that's not the case. Maybe the folks that came and settled those lands didn't want those lands because they weren't as productive, but the tribes wanted those lands. The bands wanted those lands. Those were their lands. Those were their ancestral homelands. So I really wanted to share with you that, that concept, because if you ever see that book, it really creates fierce discussions. So here's some pictures. The top left is a cut and burned over pine lands, and that's in Chippewa County, Michigan. Chippewa County is part of the Hiawatha National Forest, and it is homeland to the Sioux tribe in Sault Ste. Marie. And so this is their ancestral homelands, but that's what it looked like back in about 1903. So you can see how it was cut over, and there are stories from different Bad River and different tribes in the Lake States that say they were told stories from their elders that you could see all the way to Lake Superior. It was so clear cut. And so then we look at the right, the picture on the right, and that is a 1903 picture from a sawmill in New Hampshire. And as you can see, there's really not a lot of engineering controls to protect that water and that nasty water and the processing chemicals and everything that they're doing. It doesn't look like a real healthy place. It's definitely not what we would see now with environmental and engineering controls. And then the bottom left is slash. And so what slash is I explain it, it's like when you do a timber cut, you've got a bunch of stuff on the ground. It's kind of like the trash left over from the cut. But now it's not just left there, it's mulched back into the soil to help regenerate trees. But that is on a mountainside. It's cut over land on a mountainside in 1910 in New Hampshire. So that being said, we want to kind of I'm going to just do some quick run through here. I'm looking at my time. So there's right now, with all the forests, there's 155 national forests and 20 national grasslands on 193 million acres in 44 states. That's the entire comprehensive Forest Service. But we're going to talk about, I want to focus on the eastern region because that's what we're all familiar with. We have 17 forests and 1 tallgrass prairie with a conservation bison herd. And the reason I say that is because we work with the Intertribal Bison Council to share those bison out they come and they get the bison. But if you ever want to go, it's just south of Chicago. It's a great place. You can walk around, you can see the buffalo if they're kind enough to come to the fence, but it's a really wonderful place. But in the region, these 17 forests comprise 12 million acres of land. And the caveat of that is, unlike the West, we have over 43% of the population in this region. So we're kind of like the forests here are like little islands of green in a sea of people. So, so this is why it's really important that these lands are protected, and we are working with tribes to make sure that, that everybody is maintaining these lands. So also, I wanted to share with you that in this region and connected to these forests, we have 9 of the top 20 metropolitan areas within the US that are in this region. So, managing these forests provides drinking water, it provides recreation so folks can come. And again, when we work with the tribes, it provides that home, I'm home. So I just want to go through a couple maps. This is a map of the regions. As you can see, for the Forest Service, you can see Region 9 and Region 8 are the largest. But again, everybody tends to go out west, and you look at some of them and they're 2 or 3 states, but everybody tends to think that's the big deal out west. So this is a map of all the federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's currently 574 federally recognized tribes and 63 state recognized tribes who are located in 11 states. And if you look at this map, the purple on the lower right in the southeast, those are primarily the state recognized tribes. The blue is the removed tribes in Oklahoma, and the green are the federally recognized tribes. And so in this region, we have state recognized tribes in Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, and Vermont. And subsequently, I just wanted to share, there's a process that tribes go through to be federally recognized. And so there is, challenges when a state or a appropriation group come in and say, we're a tribe, when they haven't gone through the federal recognition process, because it takes a long time. It's a lot of process. BIA provides that federal recognition, and it gives a tribe that looking the federal government in the eye, government to government or nation to nation relationship. But in January of 2018, Virginia has now 7 new federally recognized tribes. And so that was a big deal because these tribes had worked through the process, and it was really, really important to them. And so I also want to add too, that there in the United States, there are 32 fully accredited tribal colleges and universities as well that have forestry programs, that have environmental science and natural resource programs. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So these are the reservations with significant timber resources. And so you can see in the eastern region, most of those are in the lake states, and a lot of them are in Wisconsin and Minnesota, because that's a really timber rich area. And so tribes can really benefit economically from that industry as well as other industries. And you can see there's a lot of places where you wouldn't think tribes, like Navajo Nation, most people wouldn't think that Navajo Nation has a forest products program, but they have a sawmill. They've automated their sawmill, and they are very successful at that. So I'm going to see here. Okay. So then the next slide I want to run through is this slide is the entire eastern region. The green shape areas are all the forests. The red dots are the tribal colleges in the region. The green in Oklahoma are the removed tribal reservations. And all those hash marks you see, those are all the treaties that cover the eastern region of the United States that are still in existence, that still allow rights and of hunting, gathering, access. And with that, there are 150 treaties. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. There's 150 treaties. And within that, there's 305 areas of land that were seceded to the United States government. So again, in the East, there's 89 federally recognized tribes who really continue to have rights in the interest and management of lands and programs in the Eastern Forest. 26 of these are removed tribes in Oklahoma. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. It's been a long day, guys, sorry. So there's 12 forests within treaty ceded territories of tribes who actually retain those treaty rights, and they actually exert them because based on case law from the Supreme Court, those rights have been guaranteed and those rights are now being asserted by the tribes. And this is on more than 7.5 million acres of Forest Service land. That's a lot of land. And so one thing I want to say too in this is, what makes an individual Indigenous is a tie to the land. And really that is central to who we are. And environmental protection and environmental justice are really central to the civil rights of tribes. And so we have to think about that, because when we think about actions that the federal government, state governments, or even individuals, landowners have done on these lands, it's impacted the tribes in some way or another. And really, natural resources are cultural resources. And you can split hairs and look at natural resources in those physical things, trees, water, air, soils, those types of things. Cultural resources in art, ancestral repatriations, those types of things, your historic preservation type of things. But really, it's all one, because there's many things that cross over. So I want to talk a little bit now, I'm going to finish up here, tribal self-determination and forest management. We really have 8 states who are really have tribes and tribal reservations and tribal communities who are really in the timber production game. There's actually 305 forested reservations, and they really, they have 18 million acres. That's a lot of land. And 103 of those have commercial forest operations. And so, they do have some, I have in 23 states, but some of those are like little mom and pop sawmills. Really the biggest production, when we look at and use data from the Intertribal Timber Council, commercial timber in Indian country is about 43 billion board feet. Now, remember I said earlier that there was cutting and it went up to 44.5 billion board feet. So that's a lot of resources in Indian country. And 90% of the tribal forest production is in those 8 states I mentioned, 2 of them being Wisconsin and Minnesota. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through here, but I've got the areas of the country with the highest production. Northwest, more than half the forest industry, 80% of the value comes from their harvest activities. Southwest, 30%, and Lake states, 20%. And the Eastern Forest contributes 7% of the timber volume and 3% of the revenue within Indian country. And it might not sound like a lot, but when you don't have a lot of economic growth, if you're in a smaller, like where I work, the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, that's their livelihood. That's their home. That's their heart, is timber, and managing it well, sustainably, but still being able to provide an income and jobs for their community. So there's always been some major challenges for these timber owning tribes to try to keep the money in the communities, because historically they've had to use contractors and there's been companies, and really they've exploited these resources, and they've kind of made these kind of under the table deals saying, well, in exchange for royalty or lease payments, we'll do X, Y, and Z. And stumpage fees, which is the money that's generated from timber harvest, has really been an important source of tribal income. But a lot of those profits gone because of these shady backroom deals and people looking at tribes to try and take advantage. And, you know, really, even now, a lot of the timber sawmills and that the tribes have only are producing 40% of the timber cut from Indian land. So all that timber that's being cut is going off reservation. And so that's a cost, that's a loss of income. But I want to kind of just focus on Menominee real quick, because Menominee tribe in Keshena, Wisconsin, really, you know, has proven that, you know, forest management can be successful. They are what a lot of the other tribes, Navajo has worked with them, Navajo Nation, a lot of the other tribes which have successful programs have worked extensively with Menominee Tribal Enterprises, who is their business arm of the timber. And basically, they used to have 10 million acres all over in their ancestral lands. But in 1854, they were confined to what's the current reservation, and that's only 235,000 acres now. So think about going, you know, they've been, you know, sawyers, timbers, loggers for their whole lives. That's been important to them. And so that treaty in 1854 established a reservation. But they did have, you know, their Keshena Falls sawmill was manufacturing lumber. And basically from 1871 to 1890, they ran 100 million board feet through that sawmill. And that was cut from dead and down trees. So that's a lot. That was a lot. And they were creating products for folks on the reservation. And really the backbone of their community has been the forest products industry. Their tribal enterprises was started back in 1908, and then they built a sawmill in Neopit. And then came 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act, and that restored the management of assets to the tribe. And so they were able to hold on to this. But then, as we talked about earlier, we had termination. And the Menominee Termination Act basically terminated federal supervision over property and members of the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin. And it basically required, and I'm going to read the quote here, the act required the certain provision for the protection of the forest on a sustained yield basis and for the protection of water, soil, fish, and wildlife. Menominee was able to keep their forest going through termination. Even though they were terminated, they were able to hold on. They lost everything else, but they were able to hold on to one thing, which was their forest. And so in 1973, the Menominee Termination Act was repealed, and in 75, they got everything back. And so they've taken that from pre-termination, managing through termination and grief in the community, to having a timber program and a timber industry that is incredibly meaningful to the community. And they practice sustainable management, and they follow the words of Chief Oshkosh. And Chief Oshkosh said, start with the rising sun and work toward the setting sun, but take only the mature trees, the sick trees, and the trees that have fallen. When you reach the end of the reservation, turn and cut from the setting sun to the rising sun, and the trees will last forever. And that is the foundational practice of Menominee Tribal Enterprises in managing their forest. So again, not all of the tribally owned sawmills and forest products industries have been successful. We've had Red Lake Indian Mills in Red Bee, Minnesota. It was established in 1924, and they faced financial difficulty. But we have other mills, and they shut down. You know, Red Lake lost their sawmill, but we have Navajo Nation, we have Menominee, we have the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, who are all very successful in their forestry products. So I'm going to go. But again, you know, I wanted to say too that a lot of times you have conflict within the communities, because you have folks that see the economic need of the community, but you have other folks that have other belief systems, there are other clans, they have other practices, and sometimes timber operations don't coexist with other economic and cultural goals. And so you can see on the slide, there's been some conflict in Navajo Nation over the years. I haven't seen too much conflict in Menominee because that's really how they identify themselves as a forestry tribe. But I've seen it, Confederate Salish Kootenai and other tribes, Yakima Nation, places like that, some conflicts. And so I'm going to go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go into a lot of this. I'm going to just kind of wrap up here because we're kind of getting to the end. But, there was a public law that was passed, Public Law 101-630, and that was the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act. And really that drove the strong push in Indian country to commercialize these Indian forests to provide jobs, income, and under this, tribes also recognized the recreational aspect of their lands. They looked at the aesthetic aspect of the lands, the religious aspect, and so they were able to do a much more comprehensive brush in managing their forests, but also incorporating the who and they are and what they believe, and making sure that, I've got on there the ARFA was passed, and that's the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And there have been cases because there's been some tribal members or tribes in the Forest Service who felt forestry development could damage sacred sites. And there was a case with the Yurok, Karok, and Tuala Indians to stop a logging road on Six Rivers National Forest. And so that also has allowed this kind of better shared management of these natural resources between the federal government and tribes. And so again, tribes have been working together successfully. Like I said, Menominee, tribes have been working together successfully to really talk about how management can work, how it can benefit the environment and sustainability, but also retain that culture and religious value. And one of the things we've been doing is we've been working with CONAP in Peru, bringing delegations up because Peru is now developing a forest industry. Peruvian indigenous people have to get a permit from the government to cut a tree, even though it's on their lands. Whereas here, they're trying to figure out, our folks from the bands and the tribes are going down there. And so they're sharing that traditional knowledge. So I want to kind of finish up here. Here's a little book that came out in 2016. It was kind of commissioned by the Forest Service. So if you want to read more about this and more in depth, because we could talk about this for a week and we would never scratch the surface. But this is a more in-depth narrative on American Indians and National Forest. And it really brings together secondary sources to highlight conservation history and the development of Forest Service tribal relationships. There's a lot of examples they use in there. It has an engaging history of the Forest Service Tribal Relations Program, of which I was the Eastern Region Special Assistant. But there's a shortcoming. It didn't really capture tribal voices. It didn't use a lot of the literature out there that we've done with our social science researches and tribes. So there is kind of some gaps, but it is a first step in really understanding American Indian history as it relates to national forests and the Forest Service. And so I hope this has been kind of a very quick, eye-opening experience for all of you. And maybe you've heard something here tonight that you haven't heard before. And I hope I've kind of given you a different perspective about tribes, about what's going on economically and in relation to the land and management of the land. And so I just want to say thank you so much, Mato.